In the second part of the history timeline for RCVS, we will be looking at the key events which affected the practicing profession from the start of COVID restrictions in March 2020. But, to begin with, a small aside, which will be expanded upon in a later video. In May 2019, RCVS commissioned a survey, which found 3 astonishing measures relating to the practicing arm of the profession: 94% public trust, 80% public satisfaction, and 70% of the public assessed vets fees as fair. A full 7 months later, Neil Connell made a brief comment, the only comment, on this result.
These results clearly demonstrate that there is a great deal of goodwill towards the veterinary profession, and the work they do in treating the nation's animals and serving their communities. The basis of all good relationships is trust, and it is fantastic to see that our clients continue overwhelmingly to trust our knowledge and expertise and remain very happy with the service we provide them.
Such an overwhelmingly positive survey result, following on from the survey in 2015, received a solitary comment from RCVS. There had to be a reason for this apparent oversight. And this was because RCVS, led by the name group, were profoundly distracted, at this time, by their political agenda, along with the flourishing of an authoritarian, controlling culture at RCVS. Then, COVID restrictions hit, temporarily derailing the name group's agenda for the profession, but providing an ideal opportunity to reinforce authoritarianism at RCVS. Isolated from the profession, by design, and COVID restrictions, forces, which even RCVS could not resist, looking down from its metropolitan hilltop, required RCVS to establish a COVID-19 task force. This task force looked at ways the RCVS might mitigate the burden of COVID restrictions on the practicing profession. This was a unique undertaking by RCVS. It didn't last long, and, whilst it was working, only had 1 active practitioner on its strength, out of 13 bodies in the force. Needless to say, the name group of activists were represented. The task force published some advice notes early on, quickly overtaken by the more practical advice from BVA. It suspended EMS and PSS, for obvious reasons, and addressed some concerns about the 2020 and 2021 cohort of graduates. All standard stuff, as it turned out. However, there was also a remarkable undertaking by the task force. For the only time in its history, RCVS relaxed its hand on one piece of regulation. It was almost a miracle. RCVS allowed for a temporary relaxation of prescribing regulation to permit the supply of drugs at a distance. This unique historical event did not result in calamity. There are no instances of breach of legal supply of medication or threat to public health following this retreat from the dead hand of regulation. RCVS has, of course, rescinded this relaxation of regulation to re-establish control. RCVS, with this one exception, has a history, to date, of only ever acquiring authority and control. The authoritarian grip that RCVS has established over their processes, policies, and behaviors was further extended during COVID. This was helped by the reduction in representation of the profession, through the slimming down of council numbers, and, latterly, an extraordinary tightening of control over councillor behaviors, with the commitment to a separate code of conduct. In early to mid-2020, there were some leaks of what RCVS deemed to be confidential information. This resulted in the name group taking the decision to investigate the leak, using the pretext of a complaint about this behavior against person, or persons, unknown, at RCVS. The leak may or may not have been from a veterinary surgeon or RVN. It could have been from RCVS staff, but, once the complaint was made, it was enough for the name group to authorize payment for private investigators to rake through the lives of those who might be involved. The investigators did not find the culprit or culprits. The cost of not finding those responsible for the leak has not been disclosed, but the effect of the investigation is clear. RCVS used a pretext for this investigation, and although the investigators found nothing, the name group have created a chilling effect on council and staff behaviors. Who will risk informing the profession now of radical ideas being formulated by RCVS, when the consequences could include having lists and reports compiled for scrutiny by some self-appointed guardians of morality at RCVS? Even if those reports find nothing, who knows how the process will work, and what the moral guardians will do with any other private behaviors raked up, by coincidence, during the investigation. This is a good example of the increasingly authoritarian behavior, political agenda and control that RCVS is exerting through the name group. It has nothing to do with what used to be the common ground we all shared with our Royal College, namely the excellence of our science and the progression of animal welfare standards. Aside from the political machinations from the start of COVID times, RCVS have finally abandoned Belgravia House, whose shortcomings were laid bare, as RCVS adopted hybrid working during COVID restrictions. Unfortunately, RCVS did not take the opportunity presented by proceeds of sale, and look for a radical solution, one which would prioritize reduction of establishment costs, with energy prices where they are, and also make the building more accessible to the whole profession, not just a London-based staff. It will not be relocating outside London to a modern, eco-friendly site. Instead, it will move to an unremarkable Victorian warehouse remodeled in the 1930s, in EC1, where you could have heard the sound of the Bow Bells, in less sound-polluted times. However, in a concession to sustainability, it does have a bicycle storage area to the rear. The only other event of note, in this period, created with a nod to problems faced by the profession, was the Workforce Summit held by RCVS, from which emerged the big idea.
The key action identified by the group was to rebrand the GP role, for both vets and vet nurses, to emphasize its benefits and rewards, ensure the role was aspirational and appealing, and help people choose general practice as an active career choice that they wished to pursue long term.
BVA Council were unimpressed by the event, and the glossy brochure reports which were published, pointing out how the RCVS had become a factory for ideas, an easy thing, rather than results, a much harder undertaking. Furthermore, there was no discussion of remuneration, and minimal involvement of major employers, at the summit. RCVS' response to BVA's criticism, largely coordinated by the name group, was, predictably, to double down on their virtue signaling, as if that would make the slightest difference. RCVS has entirely misunderstood their relationship with vets in practice. All that the Workforce Summit achieved was to highlight the distance between the RCVS and the profession. In summary, in 2022, firstly, there is an absence of representation of practitioners at RCVS, as seen in the COVID-19 task force. Secondly, there is an absence of award and reward of practitioners at RCVS, as in the mealy-mouthed and tardy acknowledgement of practitioner success from the RCVS survey, as well as the lack of professional awards going to practitioners. Thirdly, there is a self-granted assumption of moral authority over the profession and how it works, given to RCVS by the politics of the name group. Fourthly, there is the adoption of a controlling political agenda by RCVS that did not exist prior to 2017, which is manifestly aiming to alter the professions, reshaping them to a nebulous, divisive and unending purpose that has nothing to do with the excellence of our science and the progression of animal welfare standards. And fifthly, there is an utter lack of self-awareness at RCVS in 2022, which is problematic, because, should any external force, like government, choose to scrutinize the RCVS, these problems, outlined here, will be laid bare. At that moment, the RCVS will be declared unfit for purpose, and we will lose our self-regulating status, not because we are not trusted by the public, not because we charge unfairly, and not because we don't give the public a valued service, but because our regulator does not understand who we are, what we do, and how we do it. The solution is entirely in RCVS's own hands, if only they could see it.